Chapter 2, The Reaction in Britain. The effigy of Thomas Paine was, with great solemnity, drawn on a sledge from Lincoln Castle to the gallows, and then hanged amidst a vast multitude of spectators. After being suspended the usual time, it was taken to the Castle Hill, and there hung on a gibbet post erected for that purpose. In the evening, a large fire was made under the effigy, which was consumed to ashes, amidst the acclamations of many hundreds of people, accompanied with a grand band of music playing, quote, "God Save the King," end quote. That was a quote. I don't know where it's from, though. It has been estimated that in the winter of 1792-3, effigies of Paine were burnt in 300 or so towns and villages in England and Wales. The intensity of the reaction was an indication of the magnitude of the felt threat. His Rights of Man was one of the best sellers of the century. 250,000 copies had been sold by 1793. A London merchant wrote to Henry Dundas, the Home Secretary, quote, "Paine is a dangerous book for any person who does not share in the spoil to be left alone with, and it appears that the book is now made as much a standard book in this country as Robinson Crusoe and the Pilgrim's Press, and that if it has not its effect today, it will tomorrow," end quote. The evangelical and abolitionist leader William Wilberforce was equally anxious. William Hay of Leeds had informed him that, quote, "immense pains are now taken to make the lower class of the people discontented and to excite rebellion. Paine's mischievous work on the, quote, Rights of Man," end quote, is compressed into a 6-penny pamphlet and is sold and given away in profusion, end quote. Wilberforce replied to Hay that he did not fear a, quote, "speedy commotion," end quote, since, quote, "almost every man of property in the kingdom," end quote, was, quote, "a friend of civil order," end quote. And, quote, if a few mad-headed professors of liberty and equality were to attempt to bring their theories into practice, they would be crushed in an instant," end quote. But he still feared, quote, "a gathering storm," end quote, ahead. He was anxious that the country might provoke the, quote, "judgments of an incensed God," end quote. For what incurred his, quote, "deepest gloom," end quote, was, quote, "the prevailing profligacy of the times, and above all that self-sufficiency and proud and ungrateful forgetfulness of God, which is so general in the higher ranks of life," end quote. He was therefore thinking of, quote, proposing to the Archbishop of Canterbury to suggest the appointment of a day of fasting and humiliation, end quote. Alarm about the French Revolution had first been sounded by Burke. His reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790 began life as a response to Richard Price's, quote, "Discourse on the Love of Our Country," end quote, delivered at the Meeting House in the Old Jewry on 4th of November, 1789. The purpose of Price's discourse was to commemorate the Revolution of 1688 and to welcome the beginning of the Revolution in France. Although Price spoke of, quote, "the right to choose our own governors, to cashier them for misconduct, and to frame government for ourselves," end quote, as one of the achievements of the 1689 Revolution settlement, he did not move beyond existing radical demands for a balanced constitution within a framework of mixed government. In practice, this meant a program of parliamentary reform and a reiteration of the dissenters' campaign for the repeal of the Test and Corporation Act. Price's assumption was that France would follow the pattern set in 1688 and democratically enlarged in the American Revolution of 1776. He concluded his address, quote, "After sharing in the benefits of one revolution, I have been spared to be a witness to 2 other revolutions, both glorious," end quote. And he reiterated the Nunc Dimittis, or Nunc, Nuncdimittis, in italics. The words of the aged priest Simeon, on the occasion of the first presentation of Christ in the temple. Quote, Lord, lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, end quote. Burke fiercely contested the assumption that 1688 gave the people the right to, quote, cashier, end quote, their governors. In a calculated move to jolt Price's address away from the consensual terms of constitutional rhetoric, he compared Price's use of the nunc dimittis, with that of the Reverend Hugh Peters at the trial of Charles I in 1648. Price's, quote, Sally, end quote, differed, quote, only in place and time, but agrees perfectly with the spirit and letter of the rapture of 1648, end quote. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, sorry. In a powerful invocation of the silent majority, he also sowed suspicion about the dissenters and other French sympathizers as true representatives of British opinion. Quote, because half a dozen grasshoppers under a fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, whilst thousands of great cattle repose beneath the shadow of the British oak, chew the cud, and are silent, pray do not imagine that those who make the noise are the only inhabitants of the field, end quote. Burke was deeply skeptical of the capacity of a government based upon, quote, the rights of man, end quote, to create happiness. Human distress was largely the result of individual moral failure, not of the imperfection of institutions. Nor did the leaders of this revolution inspire confidence. Unlike 1688, the revolution in France was led by persons without legislative experience, disgruntled lawyers and malcontent, quote, men of quality, end quote. In place of the ancient nobility, quote, the Corinthian capital of polished society, end quote, and in place of a church which preached obedience to the sovereign power, this revolution was sweeping away deference to social rank, only to usher in a tyrannical democratic majority and establish a new nobility of moneylenders and stock speculators. Finally, and most seriously, without any real awareness of the consequences of their actions, the revolutionaries thought their confiscations of the lands and possessions of the church had put into question all established rights of property in France. When Burke's Reflections first appeared, most thought its stance far-fetched. Even as the revolution became more extreme, few were prepared to share Burke's lament for the passing of the, quote, age of chivalry, end quote, or his defense of the ancien regime. But Burke's attack on Price and his friends as a potential Jacobin fifth column was picked up in the provincial press, where it helped to reignite Tory and Anglican hostility towards the pretensions of the dissenters, resulting in some places in crowd actions, most notoriously in Birmingham, where the house of Joseph Priestley was destroyed on Bastille Day, 1791. Burke's approach was partially vindicated by the publication of two parts of Paine's Rights of Man in 1791 and 1792. Here was proof that the aim of French revolutionaries was not to create a new form of, quote, mixed government, end quote, but to establish an egalitarian republic. Moderate reformers hastened to distance themselves from Paine's program. The veteran campaigner for political reform, Christopher Wyville, in his defense of Dr. Price, deplored, quote, the mischievous effects, end quote, of Paine's approach in exciting, quote, the lowest classes of the people to acts of violence and injustice, end quote, and was especially incensed by the social proposals contained in the second part of the Rights of Man. In April 1792, he therefore proposed that the London Constitutional Society dissociate itself from a program which held out to the poor, quote, annuities to be had out of the superfluous wealth of the rich, end quote. The reservations of moderates did little to stem the phenomenal spread of Painite ideas in 1792. Well-supported democratic associations were established in 20 major towns with, quote, divisions, end quote, or, quote, tithings, end quote, or I think that might be actually, quote, tithings. It's Tythings. Yeah, that's probably tithings. Or, quote, tithings, end quote, formed in the surrounding countrysides. In the summer of 1792, the government decided to prosecute the rights of man in response and issued a proclamation against seditious writing. In December of that year, it even set forth a royal proclamation summoning the militia to counter, quote, the radical invasion, end quote. Governmental action was in turn massively reinforced by the initiative of John Reeves in forming loyalist associations to counteract sedition. After a few months, 1,500 associates had been formed. 1,500 associations had been formed. Such was the background to the Paine burnings of 1792-3. They were often organized by loyalist associations, both to demonstrate the extent of their local support and to intimidate radicals in surrounding areas. Loyalists also put pressure on town officials and local employers to discriminate against the employment of radicals, compelled publicans to deny radicals the hire of public rooms, and prosecuted prominent activists. By 1794, Britain was at war with France, and even in France, Britain was at war with France, and events in France were taking an ever more bloodthirsty turn. Loyalist propaganda dwelt more and more insistently upon the, quote, bloody bayonet rouge, the pike head, and the guillotine, end quote. They had been able to assemble a mass movement which, though uneven on the ground, was able to push radicals into retreat. In London, Norwich, and Sheffield, radicals still dared to defy the increasingly repressive climate. In 1795, two leading members of the London Corresponding Society, Thomas Hardy and Horne Tooke, were acquitted of treason by a London jury, and the king was jeered by crowds as he proceeded through Hyde Park. But 1795 was a turning point. After the Treasonable Practices and Seditious Meetings Act, the, quote, gagging acts, end quote, open defiance ceased. Activists found it increasingly difficult to act or assemble even in radical strongholds without suffering legal or financial persecution. Loyalist pressure was not simply a matter of control over the streets. It also narrowed the scope of intellectual debate and misrepresented its contents. The situation was worst in Scotland, where in a notorious series of sedition trials from 1793 to 1794, radicals were transported for sentences of 7 to 14 years simply for, quote, exciting disaffection to government, end quote. Political hysteria also reached the Academy. Dougald Stewart, Adam Smith's best-known disciple and first biographer, delivered his, quote, account of the life and writings of Adam Smith, end quote, to the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1793. On the evidence of the wealth of nations, Smith was an unqualified supporter of high wages far more tolerant of combinations of laborers than of masters. Indeed, Malthus chided him for confusing the, quote, happiness of the nations, end quote, with the, quote, happiness and comfort of the lower orders of society, which is the most numerous class in every nation, end quote. He was not a critic of the poor laws except of the vexations caused to the poor by removals under the law of settlement, nor is there any record of his opposing whatever relief measures might be necessary in cases of famine or high prices, since the problem simply did not arise. He was not in favor of primogeniture, and nor did he favor an established church. In the fiercely counter-revolutionary atmosphere of Scotland at the time, it is perhaps not surprising that Stewart should have minimized the importance of Smith's political preferences. In so doing, however, he initiated a distinction between political economy and politics, which was to have long-lasting effects, while his politically bloodless rereading of Smith provided one of the sources of political economy's reputation among radicals and romantics as the, quote, dismal science, end quote, and a, quote, heart of flint, end quote. Stuart admitted that Smith's, quote, speculations, end quote, along with those of, quote, Quesnay, Turgot, Compomans, and Beccaria, or it's probably Compomans, Beccaria, and others have aimed at the improvement of society, end quote. But he hastened to reassure his audience, quote, such speculations, end quote, have no tendency to uphinge established institutions or to inflame the passions of the multitude. The improvements they recommended are to be effected by means too gradual and slow in their operation, to warm the imagination of any but of the speculative few, and in proportion as they are adopted, they consolidate the political fabric and enlarge the basis upon which it rests, end quote. Stuart even obscured the undeniable fact that Smith identified with the religious skepticism of Hume, let alone the yet more uncomfortable fact that Smith's theory of moral sentiments was at the time much studied by the philosophe party among the French revolutionaries as offering a non-Christian moral theory. But worse was to come, and in 1794 he himself was obliged to disown his computer. Actually, I'm not sorry. This is the just kidding. No, this is I have to downloading the file for the last chapter in the audiobook I made for that, and now I have to save it. Come on. There we are. Alrighty. But worse was to come, and in 1794 he himself was obliged to disown his former acquaintance with the philosophe party. Two Scottish law lords asked him to retract a small reference to Condorcet in his philosophy of the human mind and to renounce, quote, in an open and manly manner, every word you had ever uttered in favor of doctrines which had led to so giant a mischief, end quote. From the 1st of February 1793, Britain was at war with France, a war originally advocated primarily by the Girondin party. Perhaps it was the association of Condorcet with the Girondins, which had led Stuart temporarily to concur with Burke's judgment on the fall of Brissot in the summer of 1793. Quote, his faction having obtained their stupendous and unnatural power by rooting out of the minds of his unhappy countrymen every principle of religion, morality, loyalty, fidelity, and honor, discovered that when authority came into their hands, it would be a matter of no small difficulty for them to carry on government on the principles by which they had destroyed it, end quote. Stuart complied with the request and accordingly expressed regret for, quote, mentioning with respect the name of Condorcet, end quote. The discussion of Paine's ideas was scarcely less febrile, F-E-B-R-I-L-E. Despite the widespread anxiety expressed by magistrates about the appeal of Paine's ideas on taxation and social insurance, those proposals were barely discussed. Instead, as George Clays had concluded from an examination of 600 contributions to the pamphlet debate on the Revolution, Paine was simply treated as a, quote, leveler, end quote, as an advocate of economic equality. This also meant that there was relatively little discussion of the one significantly redistributive element in Paine's program, the proposal to employ progressive taxation to end the practice of primogeniture. Such a measure, Paine hoped, would also lead to the breakup of great estates and the dismantling of the large concentrations of aristocratic power and wealth which had been assembled through feudal devices like primogeniture and entail. Paine's criticism of primogeniture was very similar to that of Smith, which had been made largely on the basis of utility. A minority of more perceptive or scrupulous critics took account of Paine's specific aim, but questioned the assumption that the egalitarian conditions of an agrarian yet non-feudal society like America's could be transplanted across the Atlantic. They did not think it possible to form a commercial republic in Europe more egalitarian than those of Venice or Holland. Where am I? The majority, however, insisted on interpreting Paine as if he were advocating the return of the ancient republic or the reversion to some primitive community of goods. They did so by treating his argument as if it were based solely upon an appeal to, quote, natural rights, end quote. Critics referred overwhelmingly to the argument that Paine had put forward in Part 1 of The Rights of Man, an argument which took natural rights back to the state of nature and Adam and Eve, in order to refute Burke's denial of the right of the people to move beyond the parliamentary settlement of 1688. Presenting this point as if it were the premise of an argument for economic equality, loyalists argued that all rights were civil, that there had been no natural equality and no rights in the state of nature, that Adam had not been equal with his sons, and that the society described in Genesis was most likely to have been a monarchy. Social hierarchy was therefore a natural development, and it was appropriate that sovereignty should reside not in the people, but in the legislature. All this was designed to underpin their main contention that the assumption of equality which informed Paine's vision of society was incompatible with the opulence which characterized a commercial society like that in Britain. The particular accusations flung at Paine in this debate seem even stranger when he set alongside English poor law practice at the time. For while many of the critics of the French Revolution argued that inequality was inseparable from the benefits of commercial society and feared the consequences of leading the poor to imagine that they possessed a right to relief, the reality was that a right to relief was already firmly inscribed within the existing poor law system. This reality, legal as well as moral, was stated by a legal expert in 1793. Quote, "The right to receive a compensation for their labor adequate to their necessary wants, while they had a capability of labor, is certainly due to them, and the right of maintenance from the more opulent classes of society, when that capability to labor is past, is another debt which owes them," end quote. Quote, "The occupation of the laborer," end quote, he maintained, quote, "subjects him to acute illness, chronic disorders, and at length to old age, decrepitude, and impotence," end quote. Quote, "Without the aid of his more opulent neighbors, or what is infinitely to the credit of this nation, without the interference of the godlike laws of his country, this useful class of our countrymen would sink in the arms of famine or despair," end quote. Nor were these rights new. The practice of local tax-based relief had been in existence since the time of the Henrician The practice of local tax-based relief had been in existence since the time of the Henrician Reformation as a systematization of parish charity. I think Henricians were in reference to Henry VIII and his break with the Catholic Church, but I'm not sure. That's just my uneducated guess. That process had resulted in 1572 in an act enabling justices of the peace to provide relief by means of a parochial tax codified in 1597-8 and set out in permanent form in the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601. Although it was not the main intention of the act, the right to relief was strongly reinforced by the Act of Settlement of 1662. For although an applicant for relief who did not comply with statutory residence requirements could be removed from a particular parish, his or her removal could only be to another parish where they possessed such an entitlement. Therefore, vexatious though the operation of the law of settlement undoubtedly often was, it institutionalized the duty of relief within the parochial system. Tax-based local relief had been practiced in other parts of Europe in the 16th century, but only in England did it survive in an elaborated form through to the 18th century, and only in the period after 1750 did the singularity and extent of the English poor law become a matter of repeated comment. One of the hardships created by the system, as noticed by the continental observers, was the lack of any administrative mechanism to spread the very uneven burdens placed upon rich and poor parishes. Francois, the 18-year-old future Duc de la Rochefoucauld Liancourt, Levi's calling me a little fucker, chair of the Comité de Mendicité in the early years of the French Revolution, remarked upon this inequality of local tax burden on a fact-finding visit to East Anglia in 1782, recording his impressions of Yarmouth. He commented, quote, "The poor rate is alarming, 10 shillings in the pound. I have never managed to understand the explanation of so exorbitant a tax." End quote. A more common complaint within England itself was not so much the distribution but the level of the tax, which rose steadily from the 1760s. From then onwards, calls for its abolition became increasingly frequent. The poor rate, it was argued, was a tax upon the industrious to support the idle. In the case of industrious Scotland, without a poor law was often cited to prove that such a law was unnecessary, though the counter case of Ireland, also without a poor law, demonstrated that simple correlations were inconclusive. Interestingly, however, in the decade after the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789, rate-based expenditure increased even more rapidly than before. In part, this was a response to years of exceptional and visible hardships like 1795, in part to the fear of revolution. Magistrates were empowered to set levels of relief outside the workhouse, supplementing the inadequate wages of working men with families, particularly in years of scarcity. This resorting to a, quote, rate in aid of wages, end quote, the so-called Speen-Hamlin system was to become a stock item in an endlessly repeated Victorian horror story about the bad old days before the new poor law. But it was mainly justified at the time on prudential grounds, nor was it confined to extravagant local authorities. Central government also appeared keen to ensure generous scales of relief. In a proposed poor law bill of 1796, Pitt referred approvingly to, quote, the laboring poor, end quote, and argued, quote, let us make relief in cases where there are a number of children a matter of right and an honor instead of a ground for opprobrium and contempt. This will make a large family a blessing and not a curse, end quote. Pitt opposed Whitbread's proposal for a minimum wage, but his own bill included a gamut of proposals for the alleviation of the condition of the poor: family allowances, a rate in aid of wages, money to purchase a cow, schools of industry for poor children, reclamation of wasteland, a relaxation of the law of settlement, and measures to assist the provision of insurance against sickness and old age. It is clear that politicians and magistrates, whatever the pronouncements of their propagandists, had kept one eye on the suggestions emanating from the Comité de Mendicité in France. The debate between Whitbread and Pitt was between two politicians, both of whom were attempting to devise measures in the spirit of Smith to alleviate the economic hardship of the, quote, laboring poor, end quote, in the mid-1790s. But even those followers of Smith who opposed such measures were again against any drastic change in the practice of relief. Frederick Eden, in his State of the Poor, disliked the measures proposed by both Whitbread and Pitt. He thought that a right to employment or maintenance might deter industriousness, but it would be an even greater mistake to remove such, quote, rights, end quote. The, quote, poor, end quote, or, quote, the laboring classes, end quote, were a new class created by freeing the people from bondage to the soil and through the rise of manufacture. Earlier there had been no, quote, poor, end quote, only, quote, slaves, end quote. Freed from dependence upon feudal lords, however, they still expected help when incapacitated by sickness or old age. Like other legislation set in place in an earlier age to meet different circumstances, the poor laws should be reformed, not abolished. Seen in this context, Paine's detailed proposals do not seem so outlandish. He was merely attempting to shift the emphasis from cure to prevention, as he himself put it, comparing his proposals in Agrarian Justice to the practice of the English poor laws. Quote, "It is the practice of what has unjustly obtained the name of civilization, and the practice merits not to be called either charity or policy, to make some provision for persons becoming poor and wretched only at the time they become so. Would it not, even as a matter of economy, be far better to adopt means to prevent their becoming poor? This can best be done by making every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years old, an inheritor of something to begin with," end quote. But by 1797, the year in which Paine made this proposal, the climate of opinion had begun to change fundamentally, and in such a way that within a few years the mid-90s poverty proposals of Paine and Pitt alike had been consigned to oblivion. Whether radicalism collapsed or went underground, as Edward Thompson argued in The Making of the English Working Class, is still a matter of historical debate, but of the magnitude of the shift in public opinion there can be no doubt. Disenchantment with the failures and shock of the sanguinary excesses of the Revolution were compounded by a more general welling up of wartime patriotic sentiment, never more so than in the years of 1797 and 1798, when it was fanned by mutinies in the fleet, scares about French invasion and rebellion in Ireland. The impact of these events was manifest in the falling out of former political allies and political realignments, and a far greater intolerance of atheism and free thought, in a great intensification of the new evangelical religious culture, which had been growing since the 1780s, and finally in what R.H. Tawney, in a different context, once described as, quote, "a new medicine for poverty," end quote. Although religious themes were never absent from the debate about the Revolution, the first half of the 1790s they remained subordinate. Burke, in Reflections, was exceptional in warning of the, quote, "spirit of the atheistical fanaticism in all the streets and places of public resort in Paris," end quote, and in arguing that the new ecclesiastical establishment in France was intended only to be, quote, "temporary," end quote, and, quote, "preparatory to the utter abolition under any of its forms of the Christian religion," end quote. The Loyalist response to Paine largely focused upon a defense of the existing Constitution and upon the primitivist implications of his conception of rights. Pitt's old Cambridge tutor, George Prettyman Tomline, now a bishop in his charge delivered to the clergy of the Diocese of Lincoln in 1794, spent 9 pages outlining the necessity of the Christian principles of subordination and restraint to the functioning of society, but only 6 lines on the religious basis of political obligation. At the end of The Rights of Man, Paine congratulated himself that in the whole work, quote, "there is only a single paragraph upon religion," end quote. But as it happened, that paragraph did touch the core of what was at issue between the supporters and opponents of revolution. His argument was that, quote, "every religion is good that teaches man to be good," end quote. The case for the perfectibility of man, and hence for the elimination of poverty, stood or fell on the question of whether human nature was inherently imperfect, quote, "original sin," end quote, and therefore whether restraints needed to be placed upon man's activity. The need to clear away such impediments to the possibility of perfectibility was strongly argued by Mary Wollstonecraft in 1794. Quote, "we must get entirely clear of all the notions drawn from the wild traditions of original sin, the eating of the apple, the theft of Prometheus, the opening of Pandora's box, and other tales too tedious to enumerate, on which priests have erected their tremendous structure of imposition to persuade us that we are naturally inclined to evil." End quote. Mary Wollstonecraft. Mother of Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft, the author of Frankenstein, which she wrote when she was like 18. Anyway, but his revolutionary hopes gave way to disenchantment, and the war acquired the dimension of a struggle for national survival. The Christian element in the attack on notions of perfectibility became increasingly pronounced. Sin and the vanity of human illusions about perfection were themes that the opponents of the revolution were happy to throw back at its supporters. In one of the tracts of the leading evangelical activist, Hannah More, "The History of Mr. Phantom, the New-Fashioned Philosopher," it answers to Mr. Phantom, who, quote, who has, quote, "a plan for relieving the miseries of the whole world," end quote. Mr. Truman objects, quote, But sir, among all your abolitions, you must abolish human corruption before you can make the world quite as perfect as you pretend. You philosophers seem to me to be ignorant of the very first seed and principle of misery. Sin, sir, sin. Your system of reform is radically defective, for it does not comprehend that sinful nature from which all misery proceeds. You accuse government of defects which belong to man, and of course to man collectively. Among your reforms, you must reform the human heart, end quote. For supporters of the revolution, like Mary Wollstonecraft, the only excuse for the ferocity of the Parisians was that, under the monarchy, they had lost all confidence in the laws. As she stated in 1794, quote, "When justice or the law is so partial, the day of retribution will come with the red sky of vengeance, to confound the innocent with the guilty. The mob were barbarous beyond the tiger's cruelty, for how could they trust a court that had so often deceived them, or expect to see its agents punished?" End quote. Wollstonecraft. But for its opponents, the revolution became an example of what happens when Christian restraint upon the passions is removed. The need to restrain the poor and to inculcate in them the religious duty of submission to Providence had already become prominent in the work of Sarah Trimmer, Hugh Barrington, and others in the 1780s as a response to the Gordon riots and the growth of pauperism. On the division between wealth and poverty, God's ordinance was treated by Christians, whether radical or conservative, as beyond human questioning. According to the Gospel of St. Matthew, as Christ sat in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came and poured a precious ointment over his head. The disciples strongly objected to, quote, "this waste," end quote. But Christ responded, quote, "Why trouble ye the woman, for she hath wrought a good work upon me? For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always." End quote. However unfortunate, the presence of the poor was inescapable. They formed a constituent part of the Christian cosmos. For the good Christian, poverty was not a condition to be remedied, but the spur to the exercise of humility, the practice of charity, and the striving for grace. John Wesley, when contemplating the horrors of poverty, found comfort in the promise of the resurrection. Richard Price also considered that this life was only to be judged within the framework of the eternal. However, full of temptations and tribulations, the earthly journey, what mattered was the heavenly destination. In this sense, the path of the simple poor man might be easier and more straightforward than that of the pampered rich. But the argument was pressed with even greater insistence in the face of the revolutionary threat. According to William Wilberforce's practical view of 1797, quote, "In whatever class or order of society Christianity prevails, she sets herself to rectify the particular faults, or, if we would speak more distinctly, to counteract the particular mode of selfishness to which that class is liable, thus softening the glare of wealth and moderating the insolence of power. She renders the inequalities of the social state less galling to the lower orders, whom also she instructs, in their turn, to be diligent, humble, patient, reminding them that their more lowly path has been allotted to them by the hand of God, that it is their part faithfully to discharge its duties and contentedly to bear its inconveniences, that the present state of things is very short, that the objects about which worldly men conflict so eagerly are not worth the contest, that the peace of mind which religion offers to all ranks indiscriminately affords more true satisfaction than all the expensive pleasures which are beyond the poor man's reach. End quote. Christianity exposed the false promise of perfectibility, as Hannah More admonished, quote, women of rank and fortune, end quote, in 1799, quote, the gospel can make no part of a system in which the absurd idea of perfectibility is considered applicable to fallen creatures, in which the chimerical project of consummate earthly happiness, founded on the mad pretense of loving the poor better than God loves them, would defeat the divine plan, which meant this world for a scene of discipline, not of remuneration. End quote. The strength of Christianity in the eyes of its defenders was not merely that it reconciled the poor to their subordination, but that through its conceptions of sin and redemption, punishment and atonement, it enforced morality in all classes of society, and thus held society together, especially a commercial society in which self-interest was so much to the fore. According to Wilberforce, again, quote, Christianity in every way sets herself in direct hostility to selfishness, the mortal distemper of political communities. It might indeed be almost stated as the main object and chief concern of Christianity to root out our natural selfishness and to rectify the false standard which it imposes on us, with views, however, far higher than any which concern merely our temporal and social well-being, end quote. The point was also made polemically by Hannah More. The irreligious appeared to believe that a simulacrum of morality was as good as the thing itself. Hadn't that been the teaching of Mandeville? The half-understood implications of this, quote, philosopher's, end quote, idea were dramatized in the behavior of William Mr. Phantom's manservant. Reprimanded by his master for serving guests at table while drunk, he replied, quote, very pertly, end quote, quote, sir, if I do get drunk now and then, I only do it for the good of my country and in obedience to your wishes, end quote. After being scolded, quote, in words not fit to be repeated, end quote, William again retorted, quote, why, sir, you are a philosopher, and I have often overheard you say to your company that private vices are public benefits, and so I thought that getting drunk was a pleasant way of doing good to the public as any, especially when I could oblige my master at the same time, end quote. In the course of the 1790s, the Christian riposte to the Revolution and its English supporters was also acquired an increasingly aggressive edge. If religion held society together, the irreligious were no longer an unfortunate but harmless minority. They became those who aimed at society's dissolution. Hence again, Burke was one of the earliest and most consistent exponents of this view. Already in Reflections, he referred to a, quote, literary cabal, end quote, which had, quote, formed something like a regular plan for the destruction of the Christian religion, end quote, and drew attention to a supposed conspiracy of the Bavarian Illuminist Freemasons. Thereafter, he became ever more convinced that the events in France were a, quote, revolution of doctrine and theoretic dogma, end quote, designed to, quote, get rid of the clergy and, indeed, of any form of religion, end quote, and that a, quote, system of French conspiracy, end quote, was, quote, gaining ground in every country, end quote. Quote, atheist, end quote, he remarked in 1791, were no longer like, quote, the old Epicureans, rather an unenterprising race, end quote. Lately, they had grown, quote, active, designing, turbulent, and seditious, end quote. The, quote, sworn enemies of kings, nobility, and priesthood, We have seen all the academicians at Paris, with Condorcet, the friend and correspondent of Priestley, at their head, the most furious of the extravagant republicans." End quote. He elaborated his interpretation most fully in 1796 in, quote, his letters on a regicidal peace, end quote. Britain was at war with, quote, an armed doctrine, end quote, but built upon regicide, Jacobinism, and atheism. The origins of this revolution had been brought about by two sorts of men, the philosophers and the politicians. Quote, the philosophers had one predominant object, which they pursued with a fanatical fury, that is the utter extirpation of religion, end quote. Between them, the philosophers and the politicians had been responsible for, quote, a silent revolution in the moral world, end quote, which, quote, preceded the political and prepared it, end quote. In the early 1790s, few followed Burke in believing that the revolution had been the result of a philosophical plot to destroy Christianity. James Mackintosh, the leading Whig intellectual, protested in 1791 that, quote, the supposition of their conspiracy for the abolition of the church is one of the most extravagant chimeras that has ever entered the human imagination, end quote. He argued that, quote, it was not against religion but against the church that their political hostility was directed, end quote. Quote, their purpose was accomplished when the priesthood was disarmed, end quote. Attitudes changed dramatically in 1797 with the publication of alleged proofs by Abbé Barruel in France and by John Robinson in England that either the philosophes or the Freemasons and Illuminati, or some combination of the two, had brought about the revolution and engineered the fall of the monarchy. During the sitting of the Assembly of Notables in 1788, according to Robinson, the German Illuminati, with the assistance of allies like Mirabeau and Philippe Duc d'Orléans, I don't know how to say that, sent a delegation to France. Their aim was to abolish the laws which protected property, established universal liberty and equality, quote, and as necessary preparations for all this, they intended to root out all religion and ordinary morality. This was all that the Illuminati could teach, and this was precisely what France has done, end quote. According to the popular versions of these arguments, the philosophers believed that religion had first to be overthrown before it was possible to bring down the monarchy. The fact of the publication of Paine's Age of Reason in 1796, an attack on the morality, textual consistency, and historical veracity of the Bible, seemed to prove that irreligion, sedition, and support for the national enemy were closely linked. Paine's declaration at the beginning of the book of his belief in God and hope of an afterlife cut little ice. Loyal and patriotic support for, quote, mixed government, end quote, and for existing hierarchy of ranks was now extended to encompass an allegiance to the Church of England. End of section. New section. Alongside the sharper attack upon the patriotism and good faith of the radicals in the later 1790s, there developed a noticeably harsher stance toward the poor. Once again, Burke helped to set the trend. In the Letters on a Regicide Peace, Burke had already attacked the, quote, pulling jargon, end quote, of the, quote, laboring poor, end quote, as if their condition was in itself to be pitied as opposed to those who through sickness, disability, or old age were unable to work. This was, quote, trifling with the condition of mankind, end quote, and forgetting that it was, quote, the common doom of man that he must eat his bread by the sweat of his brow, end quote. In the posthumous publication of what might originally have been intended as a memorandum, evidently unheeded, to Pitt on how to deal with the near-famine food prices of 1795, Burke argued vehemently against government intervention. Labor was, quote, a commodity, an article of trade, end quote. Quote, it is not in breaking the laws of commerce, which are the laws of nature, and consequently the laws of God, that we are to place our hope of softening the divine displeasure to remove any calamity under which we suffer or which hangs over us, end quote. All right, I need to note this. Page 88. I think I might comment on this for class. To provide for us in our necessities is not in the power of the government, end quote. Burke railed against the, quote, political canting language, end quote. Quote, charity to the poor, end quote, was, quote, a direct and obligatory duty upon all Christians, end quote. Quote, but let there be no lamentation of their condition. Patience, labor, sobriety, frugality, and religion should be recommended to them. All the rest is downright fraud, end quote. What was most remarkable about this document was that by the time Burke's executors brought it out in a posthumous edition in 1800, his insistence upon absolute non-interference with market mechanisms, even in virtual famine conditions, was interpreted without quibble as an exposition of Smith's views on the topic. Exactly why Burke's view came to be assimilated so rapidly and unproblematically with that of Smith is unclear, but it was certainly in part the result of Malthus's essay on population, which had appeared in 1798. The full title of Malthus's work was An Essay on the Principle of Population as it Affects the Future Improvement of Society, with remarks on the speculations of Mr. Godwin, Mr. Condorcet, and other writers. This essay, with its famous juxtaposition of population, which, quote, when unchecked, increased in geometrical ratio, end quote, with, quote, subsistence for man, end quote, whose increase was only, quote, in an arithmetical ratio, end quote, was an exercise in natural theology. Not everyone considered that revolutionary visions of the end of poverty and inequality could simply be countered by the undigested mixture of Genesis and political economy found in the late Burke, or the unrelieved emphasis upon sin, atonement, and the transitoriness of early life of the evangelicals. For such readers, the essay offered a more reasoned account of the impossibility of, quote, a society, all members of which should live in ease, happiness, and comparative leisure, and feel no anxiety about providing the means of subsistence for themselves and families, end quote. Malthus came from a family well versed in enlightened speculation. His father had once entertained Rousseau and Hume, and he himself had received part of his education at the famous Warrington Academy under the guidance of the prominent Unitarian and champion of, quote, rational dissent, end quote, Gilbert Wakefield. In 1784, he had entered Jesus College, Cambridge, which was at that time another renowned center of theological liberalism. Although Malthus seems always to have been destined for the church, among his Cambridge friends were to be found those who were both radical and unorthodox, in particular his tutor, William Friend, to whom he remained close into later life. In 1787, Friend publicly renounced the 39 Articles of the Church of England and espoused Unitarianism, and in 1793 he was expelled from the university for political radicalism. It is also indicative of the milieu within which Malthus moved that the essay itself was published anonymously by the radical Joseph Johnson, who was also the publisher of Godwin and Wollstonecraft. The essay was said to have been prompted by discussions between Malthus and his father about the utopian views set forth by William Godwin in his Inquiry Concerning Political Justice of 1793, and Inquirer of 1797. At the time, Malthus was a moderate Foxite Whig who opposed Pitt's coercion of British radicals and disliked Burke for his abandonment of the Foxite cause. Even after 1800, he remained a, quote, friend of peace, end quote. One reason why he was attacked so vehemently by the Romantics, especially Coleridge and Southey. In later life, he continued to support the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, Catholic emancipation, and moderate franchise reform of the kind put forward in 1832. The substantive content of Malthus's account was determined by its Christian form, that of a theodicy designed to explain the necessary presence of evil in a world created by an omnipotent, omnipresent, and benevolent God. But there was nothing traditional about the theodicy Malthus constructed, and its impact spread far beyond the ranks of Christian believers. According once more to Dugald Stewart, principal intellectual heir to Smith and prominent Edinburgh Whig, the, quote, reasoning, end quote, of the essay, quote, insofar as they relate to the utopian plans of Wallace, Condorcet, and Godwin, are perfectly conclusive and strike at the root of all such theories, end quote. Until the end of the 17th century, the theodicies were composed almost entirely out of the materials of revealed Christianity, especially Paul's reading of the fall and Augustine's depiction of the hereditary transmission of sin to the posterity of Adam. Sin was a, quote, depravity, end quote, both of reason and of will conveyed through the act of generation, which was inherently sinful because mired in, quote, concupiscence, in, quote, concupiscence, concupiscence. That God saves some to receive the gift of, quote, final perseverance, end quote, and so be saved from eternal damnation, was entirely a matter of God's grace. Earthly life was a state of, quote, trial, end quote, probation, end quote, spent in a perpetual striving to escape from the all-pervasive mesh of sin and corruption. The hold of this grim doctrine, heavily understood in Lutheran and Calvinist theologies, and propagated uncompromisingly in the religious wars of the 1600s, loosened perceptibly after 1700. Confronted by a growing challenge from free thought, by enlightened notions of justice, and by the beginnings of a historical and developmental approach to the Bible, the harsh edges of Augustinian and Calvinist doctrine yielded to a theology appealing as much to reason as to revelation. This was especially the case in 18th century Britain, where the 1688 settlement and a latitudinarian stance on questions of religious doctrine were designed to put to sleep the bloody conflicts of the previous century. Cambridge was the most important center of this new liberal theology. It built upon Newton's vision of an orderly cosmos and evidence found in nature of the power, wisdom, and goodness of God. Evil in the world was no more than the minimum necessary to accomplish God's purposes. It was from within this tradition of natural theology, running from John Ray to Edmund Law and William Paley, that Malthus composed his essay. In Political Justice, William Godwin, himself a former dissenting minister, depicted the approach of a world in which evil, together with private property, government, and punishment, would wither away. Godwin looked forward to a prospect described by Benjamin Franklin in which mind would become omnipotent over matter and death itself might be abolished. According to Godwin, there was no original sin, nor any inherent differences between men. Man was an intellectually and morally progressive being. Moral and political improvement, perfectibility, followed from the increase of knowledge. Pondering the depiction of, quote, luxury, end quote, by Mandeville and its defense by Hume, Godwin conceded that without, quote, the spectacle of inequality, end quote, which provoked, quote, the persevering exertion, end quote, of the barbarians, quote, leisure which served the purpose of literature and art, end quote, would not have been possible. But he went on, quote, though inequality were necessary as the prelude to civilization, it is not necessary to civilization's support. We may throw down the scaffolding when the edifice is complete, end quote. It was therefore only mistaken ideas of self-interest, not inherent drives or passions, which diverted man from, quote, benevolence, end quote. As knowledge and hence virtue increased,
man would become increasingly dependent upon reason alone. Both private property and marriage as forms of monopoly would be voluntarily relinquished, and since, quote, the pleasures of intellect, end quote, would be preferred to, quote, the pleasures of sense, end quote, sexual pleasure would eventually fade away. Malthus's natural theology aimed to refute Godwin, not by citing Scripture, but by, quote, turning our eyes to the book of nature, and where alone we can read God as he is, end quote. One of Godwin's principal errors was to treat man as if he were a, quote, wholly intellectual, end quote, creature, and could therefore be moved to give up private property through, quote, benevolence, end quote. Malthus responded that it was to, quote, the established administration of property, and to the apparently narrow principle of self-love that we are indebted for everything that distinguishes the civilized from the savage state, end quote. It was not the unaided processes of mind which spurred men into action, but, quote, the wants of the body, end quote, that roused, quote, the brain of infant man into sentient activity, end quote. If Godwin's commonwealth were brought into being and those, quote, stimulants to exertion, which arise from the wants of the body, were removed from the mass of mankind, we have more reason to think they would be sunk to the level of brutes, from a deficiency of excitements, than that they would be raised to the ranks of philosophers by the possession of leisure, end quote. No sufficient change had taken place in, quote, the nature of civilized man, end quote, to suggest that he might, quote, safely throw down the ladder, end quote, by which he had risen to his present, quote, eminence, end quote. The progress of man from savagery to civilization was not the product of the unaided and inherent activity of the mind. The creation of mind was not the cause but the effect of a struggle of cosmic dimensions, in which, quote, the world and this life, end quote, could be seen as, quote, a mighty process of God for the creation and formation of mind, a process necessary to awaken inert chaotic matter into spirit, end quote. And, quote, necessity, end quote, the principle of population, provided the means by which man, quote, as he really is, inert, sluggish, and averse from labor, end quote, was compelled into activity by God. Quote, the savage would slumber forever under his tree unless he was roused from his torpor by the cravings of hunger or the pinchings of cold, end quote. Indeed, in this new and decidedly heterodox version of Christianity, original sin was no longer the product of activity, the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but of, quote, not of, quote, I don't know why I said quote, but of passivity. Quote, the original sin of man is the torpor and corruption of the chaotic matter, in which he may be said to be born, end quote. This life was therefore no longer a state of, quote, trial, end quote, or, quote, probation, end quote, in which the Christian should accept his allotted rank with cheerfulness and humility. It was rather a state of, quote, universal exertion, end quote, whose strong and constantly operative stimulus was, quote, the superiority of the power of population to the means of subsistence. Had population and food increased in the same ratio, it is probable that man might never have emerged from the savage state, end quote. Inequality formed part of this divine scheme. Quote, if no man could hope to rise or fear to fall in society, if industry did not bring with it its reward, and idleness its punishment, the middle parts would not certainly be what they are now, end quote. It was for the same reason that the, quote, passion between the sexes, end quote, was, quote, necessary, end quote, and would remain, quote, nearly in its present state. One second. Come on. Forgive me. It was for the same reason that, quote, the passions between the sexes, end quote, was, quote, necessary, end quote, and would remain, quote, nearly in its present state, end quote. Quote, the principle according to which population increases prevents the vices of mankind or the accidents of nature, the partial evils arising from general laws, from obstructing the high purpose of the creation, end quote. Such a law could not operate, quote, without occasioning partial evil, end quote. But evil in this eccentric theodicy was a sort of good. Quote, evil exists in the world, not to create despair, but activity, end quote. Despite its title, Malthus's direct criticism of the social insurance programs of Condorcet and Paine was cursory. Not more than 10 out of nearly 400 pages were devoted to Condorcet's proposals, and in the first edition, Paine was not even mentioned. The treatment was assertive, lacking in detail, and at best loosely targeted, because it appeared to have been tacked on to an argument devised to refute the differing claims and assumptions of Godwin. Condorcet, and in the second edition, Paine, presented no theodicy. They could only be conjoined with Godwin insofar as they also subscribed to, quote, the great error under which Mr. Godwin labors throughout his whole work, the attributing almost all the vices and misery that are seen in civil society to human institutions, end quote. Malthus dismissed these institutional causes of misery as, quote, mere feathers that float on the surface, end quote. In other respects, the difference between Godwin and Condorcet or Paine were fundamental. Paine and Condorcet accepted self-interest as the basis of society and government, and pushed Adam Smith's, quote, natural progress of opulence, end quote, in an egalitarian direction. They criticized monopolies and excessive concentration of private property in land, the land, but not the principle of private property itself. Like Smith, they considered security of property a source of progress and independence. They praised commercial society as an advance upon the feudal past, shared Smith's confidence in capital investment, and rejected ascetic and moralistic attitudes towards luxuries. By contrast, Godwin thought private property a source of injustice, dependence, greed, and egoism. Like Rousseau and Price, he associated commerce and luxury with inequality and depopulation, and his picture of commercial society was that of Mandeville rather than Smith. Commercial society was, however, only a transient phase in the progress towards a truly egalitarian civilization, where the main stimulus to activity would be, quote, love of distinction, end quote, and ultimately a purely impersonal love of justice. According to Malthus, Condorcet's proposal might appear, quote, very promising upon paper, end quote, but, quote, applied to real life, they will be found to be absolutely nugatory, end quote. The provision of cheaper credit institutions for the poor, he believed, would place, quote, the idle and negligent, end quote, on the same footing as, quote, the active and industrious, end quote, and would necessitate, quote, an inquisition, end quote, to examine claims which would be, quote, little else than a repetition upon a larger scale of the English poor laws, end quote. It would be, quote, completely destructive of the true principles of liberty and equality, end quote. But these were no more than elaborations of his basic objections, that the existence of a social insurance fund would remove, quote, the god of necessity, end quote, from, quote, the labor necessary to procure subsistence for an extended population, end quote. Quote, were every man sure of a comfortable provision for a family, almost every man would have one, and were the rising generation free from the, quote, killing frost, end quote, of misery, population must readily increase, end quote. In essence, the attack on Condorcet was little more than the specification of a larger but generally unavowed object of attack, the stance towards laborers adopted by Adam Smith himself. Smith accepted as a truism that, quote, The demand for men, like that of any other commodity, necessarily regulates the production of men, quickens it when it goes slowly, and stops it when it goes too fast." End quote. But this did not mean that the poor only worked when pushed by, quote, necessity, end quote. Among the reasons Smith gave for his support for high wages was that the laborer was likely to be encouraged, quote, by the comfortable hope of bettering his condition, end quote. Quote, "Where wages are high, accordingly we shall always find the workmen more active, diligent, and expeditious than where they are low," end quote. Conversely, as he argued about the dissenting clergy and the wealth of nations, quote, "Fear is in almost all cases a wretched instrument of government, and ought in particular never be employed against any order of men who have the smallest pretensions to independency," end quote. Smith never employed the notion of, quote, indolence, end quote, in connection with the laboring poor. This he reserved for depictions of the landed classes and the established clergy. Condorcet and Paine had only reiterated Smith in expressing their confidence in the natural progress of opulence upon the laborer's hope of bettering his condition. Smith made no reference to the, quote, God of necessity, or goad of necessity, end quote, nor did he suggest any essential difference of mentality between rich and poor. On the contrary, he assumed an equality of, quote, natural talent, end quote. The differences between the philosopher and the street porter, quote, much less than we are aware of, end quote. The differences between the philosopher and the street porter were, quote, much less than we are aware of, end quote, and were, for the most part, the effect rather than the cause of the division of labor. Persons from all classes desired respect, quote, to be taken notice of with sympathy, end quote, to be decently attired, and to be able to appear without shame in public. In Malthus's essay, there was a palpable shift. In his opinion, quote, the laboring poor, to use a vulgar expression, seems always to live from hand to mouth. Their present wants employ their whole attention, and they seldom think of the future. Even when they have an opportunity of saving, they seldom exercise it, but all that is beyond their present necessities goes, generally speaking, to the alehouse, end quote. His polemic against the poor laws was also premised upon an assumption of the lack of any discernible desire among the poor to preserve their self-respect. The poor who went to the alehouse would save and not drink, quote, if they didn't know they could rely on parish assistance for support in case of accidents, end quote. The laborer would behave differently if he were assured that, quote, his family must starve or be left to the support of casual bounty, end quote. Unlike Smith's poor, who were brought within the norms of civil society by sympathy, neighborhood, custom, and education, Malthus's poor, even when they knew better, were governed by, quote, their bodily cravings, end quote. Quote, the cravings of hunger, the love of liquor, the desire of possessing a beautiful woman, end quote. Soon after the essay originally appeared, clerical friends evidently pointed out to Malthus its unsoundness as an exercise in Christian homiletics. He had ascribed, quote, misery, end quote, not to the fall and the original, quote, depravity of man, end quote, but to the laws of nature. He had nothing to say either about the incarnation or about the resurrection. Man was made in, quote, the image of God, end quote. How then could he be, quote, inert, end quote, and, quote, sluggish, end quote? Worse still, Malthus's God, despite his omnipotence and omniscience, apparently made mistakes. Quote, the works of the Creator, end quote, Malthus maintained, were, quote, not formed with equal perfection, end quote. Finally, in God's cosmic struggle to create mind, imperfect specimens rather than await the day of judgment, appeared to return to the, quote, inertia of matter, end quote, a solution nearer to Seneca than to the New Testament. In the second edition of the essay, which appeared in 1803, Malthus recast his, quote, principle of population, end quote, along more orthodox Anglican lines. Ideas about the divine process of the creation of mind were replaced by more orthodox conceptions of the world as a state of trial, and by foregrounding the prudential check in the shape of deferred marriage. Malthus's theodicy therefore appeared to converge with the more conventional anti-Jacobin emphasis about Christianity's capacity to introduce restraint. In this way, he was also able to produce a Christian conception of an individually attainable way out of poverty, and a sustainable improvement in the standard of life for the lower classes. According to Waterman, merely as a result of self-love, individuals defer marriage to achieve, quote, a target income, end quote. This restricts the supply of labor, raises its price, and thereby brings about an unintended and beneficent outcome. Marriage and private property turn out to be the most effective institutions in harnessing self-love to the goals of benevolence. In recent years, historians have also revised the received interpretation of Malthus in other respects. They have emphasized Malthus's moderate reformism and his association of prudence among the lower classes with education and civil and political liberty in the second and subsequent editions of the essay. They've also recognized his achievement as a pioneer in the understanding of the operational constraints of the early modern economy. Malthus himself observed that, quote, the histories of mankind that we possess are histories only of the higher classes, end quote. And Malthus argued for inquiries into the, quote, observable differences in the state of the lower classes of society with respect to ease and happiness at different times during a certain period, end quote. According to the foremost historian of English demography, A.E. Wrigley, quote, there is now a substantial body of evidence supporting Malthus's view of the relationship between rates of population growth, real wage changes, and the operation of the preventive check during the centuries immediately before his birth, end quote. And this achievement has been underlined by Wrigley's own researches, which have confirmed the reasonableness of the concern found both in Malthus and in the work of his great contemporary, the political economist David Ricardo, about declining marginal returns to land. As Wrigley explains it, quote, the point is simple. Land was a necessary factor in all forms of material production to a degree not easily recognized in a post-industrial revolution setting. Almost all raw materials were either vegetable or animal, even where mineral raw materials were employed, they were capable of conversion into a useful form only by burning a vegetable fuel. Much the same was also true of the sources of mechanical and heat energy. Human and animal muscle and wood fuel were the preponderant means by which raw materials were converted into useful products and transported to places convenient for their subsequent use or consumption. Therefore, the productivity of the land set limits to the scale of industrial activity no less than to the level of food consumption. Each of these two great consumers of the products of the land was necessarily in competition with the other for the use of a factor of production whose supply could not be expanded, end quote. But however salutary these correctives, they cannot entirely dispel the criticisms his original antagonists directed at Malthus. In the first place, it was not true that Condorcet, or for that matter Godwin, had not considered the difficulty posed by population. Condorcet believed that if a time were to come when, quote, the number of men shall surpass the means of their subsistence, end quote, that time would be, quote, extremely distant, end quote. Malthus countered that, quote, this constantly subsisting cause of periodical misery has existed ever since we have had any histories of mankind, does exist at present, and will forever continue to exist, end quote. But he never wholly explained why that should be the case when so much of the globe's surface still remained uncultivated. This was Godwin's original response, and it was an objection repeated by Hazlitt, Coleridge, and Southey, whatever the other changes in their subsequent political positions. Condorcet himself stated that if at some remote point the limits of population might be reached, quote, the progress of reason will have kept pace with that of the sciences, and the absurd prejudices of superstition will have ceased to corrupt and degrade the moral code by its harsh doctrine instead of purifying and elevating it, end quote. A veiled reference to contraception plainly discussed in an unpublished manuscript on the 10th epoch. Malthus referred to Condorcet's removal of the difficulty, quote, in a manner which I profess not to understand, end quote, while also accusing him of advocating, quote, promiscuous concubinage, end quote, which it was widely believed at the time, quote, would prevent breeding, end quote. His objection to either of these solutions was moral. Quote, to remove the difficulty in this way will surely, in the opinion of most men, be to destroy that virtue and purity of manners, which the advocates of equality and of the perfectibility of man profess to be the end and objective of their views. End quote. Finally, even if Malthus were correct about the general, quote, oscillation, end quote, between prosperity and indigence produced by the population principle in the early modern world, he did not establish any close correlation between those oscillations in England and the history of the Poor Laws. Despite the existence of these laws since Tudor times, England had increased in prosperity at least after 1688. Malthus himself noted a happy conjuncture between, quote, character, end quote, and, quote, prudential habits, end quote, in the period before 1750. Furthermore, as Malthus was to admit in 1817, the Poor Laws had not lowered the age of marriage. Historians generally suggest that Malthus, quote, softened, end quote, his position in the second edition of 1803 and adopted a more optimistic assessment of the chances of improvement in the condition of the poor. But this is only half true. On the question of social security and the rights of the poor, Malthus not only adopted a harsher tone, but presented an alarmist, even apocalyptic scenario. For the first time, he discussed Paine's Rights of Man, which, according to him, had done, quote, great mischief among the lower and middling classes of people in this country, end quote. After objecting in reasonable terms that Paine underestimated the differences between Britain and America, he attacked Paine's tax proposals not only as ruinous but as a short path to tyranny, aided by a mob composed of the, quote, redundant population, end quote, of all monsters the most fatal to freedom, end quote. The habit of attributing distress to the nation's rulers or to the character of political institutions he now considered to be, quote, the rock of defense, the castle, the guardian spirit of despotism, end quote. Its prevalence was particularly dangerous in a year of near famine prices, such as 1800 to 1801. The example of the French Revolution, which had, quote, determined in military despotism, end quote, The example of the French Revolution, which had, quote, terminated in military despotism, end quote, showed how dangerous it was when any, quote, dissatisfied man of talents has power to persuade the lower classes of people that all their poverty and distress arise solely from the iniquity of government, end quote. It was the thought of the, quote, mischief, end quote, done by Paine that led Malthus to assert in far more emphatic and unequivocal terms than anything he had written in the first edition that, quote, there is one right which man has generally been, quote, there is one right which man has generally been thought to possess, which I am confident he neither does nor can possess, a right to subsistence when his labor will not fairly purchase subsistence. Our laws indeed say that he has this right and bind the society to furnish employment and food to those who cannot get them in the regular market, but in so doing they attempt to reverse the laws of nature, and it is in consequence to be expected, not only that they should fail in their object, but that the poor who are intended to be benefited should suffer most cruelly from this inhuman deceit which is practiced upon them. End quote. And he continued to the thought in a notorious passage which his opponents never allowed him to forget, even though he withdrew it in the third edition of 1806 and in subsequent editions. Quote, a man is born in a world already possessed if he cannot get subsistence from his parents on whom he has a just demand. And if the society do not want his labor, he has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food, and in fact has no business to be where he is. At nature's mighty feast there is no vacant cover for him. She tells him to be gone and will quickly execute her own orders, if he does not work upon the compassion of some of her guests. End quote. Malthus. The position adopted by Malthus in important ways exemplified not only how fear of the French Revolution changed the terms of the debate about poverty, but also about the polity as a whole. In the 18th century, as Mark Phillip has written, the primary fear had been of arbitrary executive rule and the pretensions of the crown. As a result of the Revolution, the crown began to acquire a widespread and unheard-of popularity and something of the respectability it eventually achieved in the Victorian era. At the same time, while the, quote, mixed constitution, end quote, was endowed by Burke with a sanctity which subsequent reform movements came tacitly to accept, there had developed a deeper and more lasting fear of the mobilization of the masses. Malthus summed up the change quite precisely in 1803. Quote, as a friend to freedom and an enemy to large standing armies, it is with extreme reluctance that I am compelled to acknowledge that, had it not been for the organized force in the country, the distresses of the people in the late scarcities, encouraged by extreme ignorance and folly of many among the higher classes, might have driven them to commit the most dreadful outrages and ultimately to involve the country in all the horrors of famine. Great as has been the influence of corruption, I cannot yet think so meanly of the country gentlemen of England as to believe that they would thus have given up a part of their birthright of liberty, if they had not been actuated by a real and genuine fear that it was then in greater danger from the people than from the crown. End quote. 1 second. In the longer term, the debate on the French Revolution, as Greg Clays has shown, led to a general retreat from the language of rights on the part of the moderate Whigs and the adoption of a language of, quote, commerce, manners, and civilization, end quote. Natural rights were henceforth left to the working classes and thoughts of republic confined to a small minority of ultra-radicals. What Malthus added to this basic political shift was a new way of thinking about poverty and inequality, quite as momentous as the proposals of Condorcet, Paine, and Godwin, which provoked it, and with far more immediate effect. The poor were no longer those, quote, ye have, always with you, end quote, a constant presence recalling to us the vanity of earthly ambition and false pride, and an unceasing reminder of our duty to practice the Christian duty of charity. The political and cultural significance of Malthus's shift towards an emphasis upon, quote, prudential restraint, end quote, was that poverty could be avoided. But if it could be avoided, it should no longer be condoned. Quote, dependent poverty, end quote, as Malthus remarked in the first edition of the essay, quote, ought to be held disgraceful, end quote. Like Paine, Malthus wished to do away with the existing poor laws. Like Godwin, he supported independence of judgment, but, quote, independence, end quote, was no longer counterposed to dependence upon a bloated aristocracy or upon the sinecures, monopolies, and vested interest of a corrupt state. It now meant the individual's independence of all forms of parish authority, especially the alleged tyranny of overseers enforcing the law of settlement and the ability to depend upon one's own individual resources. Hence, reformers, at least of the, quote, philosophical, end quote, kind, whatever their continuing criticism of the aristocracy or the rich, felt obliged also, or perhaps even primarily, to couple progress with the possibility of overcoming the, quote, indolence, end quote, of the, quote, working classes, end quote. John Stuart Mill might claim that only from the time of the 1798 essay, quote, has the economical condition of the laboring class has been regarded by thoughtful men as susceptible of permanent improvement, end quote. But this new awareness came at the cost of projecting onto the, quote, laboring poor, end quote, a new form of moral pedagogy, which not surprisingly encountered strong resentment. Cobbett and other representatives of the, quote, working classes, end quote, denounced it as a spurious justification for a scheme to remove the existing rights of the poor. The presence of a Tory romantic strand in Chartism becomes more understandable. Such a scheme proved particularly offensive when harnessed to a new and up-to-date justification of inequality. Inequality was no longer synonymous with a God-ordained hierarchy of ranks, but man-made and thus the result of indolence or economic incompetence. Malthus had no desire to defend the, quote, present great inequality of property, end quote, as, quote, either necessary or useful to society, end quote. But he only wished to, quote, prove the necessity of a class of proprietors and a class of laborers, end quote. In other words, he was not prepared to defend traditional and hierarchical forms of inequality in the manner of Burke, but he was happy to defend the new form of inequality associated with commercial society and indeed provide divine support for it. The point was most eloquently put by his disciple and future Archbishop of Canterbury, John Bird Sumner. Quote, in his essay, Inequalities of Ranks and Fortunes. No, that's not an essay. Quote, Inequalities of ranks and fortunes, end quote, argued Sumner in 1816, was the condition best suited to the development of human faculties and to the exercise of virtue, just as Newton had brought, quote, the mechanism of the natural world, end quote, under the operation of a, quote, single and universal law, end quote, so the moral realm was also subject to, quote, the operation of a single principle, end quote, the principle of population, according to the, quote, design of the Creator, end quote. Therefore, existence on earth was, quote, a state of discipline in which the various faculties of mankind are to be exerted, and their moral character formed, tried, and confirmed, previous to their entering upon a future and higher state. Life, therefore, is with great propriety described as a race in which a prize is to be contended for, end quote. End of chapter 2. That's the end of the Jones reading we have to do.